In this tutorial, we're going to take a look at how to export the displacement and normal map detail from our model in ZBrush. But before we do that, we have to set up the appropriate UVs in order for this to happen in a way that we get the maximum amount of detail possible. And we need to do that by starting in Maya. So what I have right now is the same head that I created in the previous tutorial where I split the blend shapes in half. And if we recall that, if we go to Windows, Modeling Editors, UV Editor, when I created that, I have, oops, this is really big here. Hold on, pull that back. What I have here is a model that fits within just a single UV tile and is sort of aligned right down the center so that if I created a gradient across it, then that gradient could nice and easily be symmetrical. What I am doing now is I need to actually split my different components of my head into different sections and create different tiles so that I can maximize the amount of available UV space. If you think of each one of these UV tiles as just a square image in Photoshop, for instance, then the more area that the head, for instance, takes up, the more pixels that we can fit inside that head. Now, the head itself can't overlap any one of these bounding boxes for these edges for our UV tile, because if I overlap this tile or this part of the head here over to here, for instance, then I'm actually going to be repeating the texture that's here because these are basically just repetitions of each other. But what I can do is I can create what's called a multi-tile layout where each tile is assigned a different texture, a different texture file. And I can maximize things by saying, well, maybe I could take half of the head and assign half of the head to just this tile here and the other half over here. And now I've really increased the amount of texture space available. So in order to do this, I'm going to go ahead and make my UVs here much bigger so that I basically try to stretch it out to fit as much of this head into one tile as I can. And I'm going to right click here and go to UV shell, so I'm selecting just the shells. And I'll just drag a big selection around everyone. I'm doing it this way because I want to make sure that all the shells remain equally proportioned to each other based on the way that they were created originally here. So this just means that if I scale one thing up, I'm scaling them all up in equal amount. So what I'm going to do here is just grab the scale tool and do a universal scale. Right, and I'm just going to put the heads closer to here. Now I'm not really too worried about the left to right distance. It's the top to bottom distance that's actually the part here that I want to work with. So let's just keep scaling that up until we're pretty close to those edges, just where they don't overlap. And I think if I zoom in here, that's not overlapping yet. And that's not overlapping, so that's pretty good. That's close enough. And then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to split things in half here, at least down the center line of the head. And in order to do that, I need to go into edge mode. So what I'll do is I'll find the center line here. Notice that since I'm working on the lowest resolution possible, this is easier because I have less geometry to deal with. So I'll just double click on that center line. Now that selects everything, including this piece right here, which I don't need that to be selected actually. In fact, I'm just going to deselect that by holding down Control and clicking on that. However, I do need the bottom part here to also be included in this. So I'll hold down Shift and double click on that. So now I have all of the middle part of the head selected like this. And what I'm going to do is go to it's actually been changed around here in the more recent version of Maya 2017. You'll want to come over here to Cut/Sew and choose Cut. And what that does is it basically separates the edges so that there is now basically a left side and a right side. If you're working in a previous version of Maya, even an earlier version of Maya 2017, it would still be here under this leftmost menu. And you'd find something like Cut UVs. Okay, so now if I right click and I choose UV shell, you'll see that I have a left shell and a right shell. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep them in the same the same vertical orientation. I'm just going to move them horizontally. So I will move this guy over a bit, and I'm going to put them really super duper close to that edge. I don't want them to be touching the edge. I just want it to be really incredibly close to it. Something like that will work. And this is actually for a couple of reasons. You would probably find if you watch some older tutorials that you were never advised to actually sort of cut something straight down the middle of a face, for instance, because you could leave seams. Now, fortunately, with a lot of the more recent software and the way that we create our texture detail, we're not so concerned about that because we're drawing that texture detail right on the surface of our models. And as a result, it sort of automatically solves the seam problem. But all the same, in a software like Mari, for instance, where I can go in and I can adjust and paint directly onto the UVs or directly onto the model in the three-dimensional view, sometimes I do need to still be painting across two different UV shells. And I want my paint strokes to be, not having to go too far between these two UV shells while still keeping them separate. And the only reason why I don't have them going all the way strictly right to that line is because it is possible to accidentally have a little bit of an overlap there, and now you start to repeat pixels or you start to acquire unexpected artifacts. So I just pull it back just a tiny bit, enough so that if I were painting there, I wouldn't have to really do much extra work to complete a stroke across both shells, but enough also so that I don't end up getting unexpected artifacts as well. Also, it does help me to reduce the amount of unused texture space that I have over here. And I think, as I mentioned in a previous video, I have separated the ears on this model, which is not necessarily the case in the way that we have otherwise done this UV layout. Like if you'd use the standard layout that comes with Make Human, for instance, they don't separate the ears. It's up to you. I do it this way just because I get sort of a flatter result this way. Now what I'm going to do is I'll start with the big pieces first. I'm going to start with the neck, which is this piece here. I'm going to bring this over, and I can't really fit it in anywhere unless I rotate it. So I'm going to hold down E, and then I'll hold down J. And as I hold down J, it will snap this to 90-degree increments. And I'm just going to move this over somewhere like this. Also grab the inside of the mouth, and let's pull this down to this side here. Now with these pieces, it doesn't really matter where they go. So long as you're filling up the texture space, that's fine. So I'll grab this guy here, I'll pull down the left ear on this side, and the left inner eyeball on this side. And what you could do, if you wanted to, you could decide that you want to take the pieces that are associated with either side and put them to either side. So something like that. And these don't have to perfectly match up. It doesn't really matter. When you have more pieces altogether, especially if you have symmetrical pieces, it's a good idea to keep the pieces that are associated with one side in a single UV tile. I could split the neck if I really wanted to, but I don't think it's necessary. It's just creating extra seams that we don't really need. And same thing with the interior of the mouth. So this right here will work well for our purposes, and I'm going to export this out, and in the next tutorial I'm going to bring this into ZBrush, and we're going to start looking at the actual export process for the displacement map. So just really quick, I'll close out of that, and I will just say File, Export Selection, and I have already saved this out before as UV gradient.obj, just a similar naming like that. Actually, so that was the gradient one, excuse me. That was the one I just brought in. What I want to save this one out as is UV disp, D-I-S-P, for displacement. It's also going to be used for the normal map and some other things, but I just call it UV disp because that's actually the easiest way for me to remember it. You could call it whatever you want, But so long as we can differentiate between the gradient layout and the displacement UV layout, that's fine. It is possible actually in a Maya file to save different UV maps on the same geometry, but because we're applying it here to just OBJs, and we have to work with OBJs inside of ZBrush, I keep them as separate models with the two separate UV layouts. And inside of ZBrush, you will go back and forth between whether or not you need the gradient UVs or the displacement UVs, depending on the process that you are currently undertaking. You can go back and forth with it, so long as you don't change your underlying base geometry. If you do, you'll have to update it. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and in the next tutorial, I will be back in ZBrush and we'll be exporting out our displacement maps.